So if we are not postmodern anymore, what are we? What is happening to us? And did the pandemic make it worse, is my question now. After studying post whatever-ish for the last few years, 3.5 years or so, is the pandemic just going to hyperspeed the things that we are already going through, or is the pandemic going to launch us into yet another way of being and formation of society? We have no idea. But first, let's look at that 2005 to, I don't know, a year ago, roughly, and see what that looks like. So when I first started looking at that, are we postmodern? Are we after postmodern? The reason why I went to the internet and said something has to be going on is when I woke up in the morning and read the headlines and somebody said, well, those are alternative facts. And I was like, wait, what? What do you mean alternative facts? Because if you think, remember the modern world and social construction of reality and objective truth, that even if knowledge is decided upon, that deciding was still approximating a real thing, a real truth, an objective truth, the idea that there is one and that we can get close to that. When somebody came on TV and said, but those are alternative facts, I was like, now wait a minute, we are not believing in truth anymore? We believe that you get to have facts and I get to have facts and other people get to have facts and we all get to have our own now, instead of we as a society somehow approximating truth. So that's kind of what led me to the internet. And some of the things that people are calling this time period now are postmodernism, metamodernism. Pseudo-modernism is what I see more often, though. So it's about 3 or so years into me looking into this stuff, and pseudo-modernism kind of seems to be the word, because do we really want to be post-postmodernism and then post-postmodernalism and then post-postmodernalism? We kind of have to have a new word, right? So pseudo-modernism seems to be where we're going with that. And what happens with that pseudo-modernism thing is the biggest change is the relationship between the author and the text, which is kind of a vague concept, right? But if you think back about Shakespeare wrote things theoretically 500-something years ago. I don't remember when Shakespeare was alive, but long time ago. Have Shakespeare's words changed? Or can I pick up a book that Shakespeare wrote and it's still the same words? My interaction with it is going to be different because it's 500 years later, it's a totally, completely different society, etc., etc. But the words don't change. So the relationship between the author and the text is a one-sided relationship. The text is not changing. The viewer of the text is changing. You don't have any power over that text. Just the author has power over that text. But enter the internet, enter comment sections, enter Twitter and Facebook and social media, and shows that require voting and Google Maps and all that stuff. It has created a life in which the text is ever-changing and in which the text is controlled by and influenced by regular, everyday people. So if you think about watching The Masked Singer or whatever the heck they have now, and you vote, do you watch reruns of those? Like back in the day, you would binge watch an entire series. Well, we didn't used to binge watch. We used to watch it when they had it and then catch reruns in the summertime if we were lucky. And then we got to where, I can watch them on the internet. And then it got to where there was so much interaction between the public and the show that as soon as the show's over, then it's pretty much worthless. Once you have the winner, are we really going to watch reruns of this thing? Or is it over? So shows that require voting are huge. Google Maps changes because I have it on my phone. And I have whatever that tracing is, data access. So Google knows where I am. And Google knows when I slow down. And Google knows when I speed up. And Google knows when I'm approaching a police officer and will tell me those things. So it's that constant interactive, it's active, it's spectacular, active participatory, instead of just sitting back and watching something that somebody else made, reading something that somebody else wrote. You are actively engaging with the material. You're voting. So what you do influences what the show looks like next week. And that's a very different way of everything, really, than it was before the rise of the internet. You can go post-Marx now and say, you know, Marx is looking at the owners of the means of production. Well, can you have owners of the means of production if you have a globalized market? Or do you have a handful of globalist people that have no tie whatsoever to any one space on this earth that control most of what we do? You know, boards of directors and owners of multinational corporations, they are very interested in profit. And because we have the ability to move quickly all over the world, they're not stuck anywhere. So it's globalized. What happens in Indonesia impacts the markets here. What happens in Asia impacts the markets here. What happens in Europe impacts the markets here. What happens here impacts the markets in Asia. We are no longer independent little markets. We are now a global capitalist system. And at the same time, there's this weirdness about being conformist, that idea that we participate in that market by buying the same things that everybody else buys. We are a very highly consumerist culture, fast fashion, fast music. We get tired of things very, very quickly and move on to the next cool thing. And every next cool thing is the same next cool thing that everybody else wants to get. So now we put in the other fun stuff. What about the fear, the ignorance, the fanaticism, and the anxiety? It's kind of an interesting world when you give over the power of storytelling to everybody. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. Remember, in sociology, we're studying things that exist, neither good nor bad, sometimes both. It just is. So if you think about how stories used to be curated. We used to know about things because the media told us. We used to know about something that happened in Central Asia because it made our world news. If you think back to the bombings and the gassings that Assad did of his citizens in the early civil war in Syria, that didn't make the news. They were not allowing any kind of journalists in there. So the only way that we knew that that was happening is because people in Syria were uploading videos to YouTube saying, look what's happening here. Same thing with early coronavirus. A lot of what we knew about the coronavirus were people in China uploading videos saying, it's bad, you have no idea what's happening now. And it's a good thing and a bad thing to give everybody voice, right? So with the voice becomes, again, the whole question of what's real and what's not real. If everybody can tell their story, then who gets to decide what the story is? And then the same author that was looking at that atmosphere of fear, ignorance, fanaticism, and anxiety was a little anti-millennial and Generation Z or whatever you guys are, saying that you are adulting, with air quotes, that you can talk to people all over the entire world, but you don't know how to make something to eat. Or you can do all this amazing technological stuff, but you want to go to a cereal bar or a cat cafe. So that fusion of childish and advanced and powerful and helpless is what this author was looking at. So in a sense, this post-postmodernism, metamodernism, whatever, is tribalism to the extreme and with gloves off. I like that description. I put the entire paragraph up here because they're trying to decide if it's an intensification of postmodernism or if it's something completely different. It is not constrained by truth. That is one of the bigger differences between those two things. There's a recognition that we don't have the absolute truth. And it's not just that, but it doesn't really matter that we don't have the absolute truth. We really don't care that we don't have the absolute truth. It doesn't change anything. If you wonder how something like QAnon can develop, it's because of this. It doesn't matter. You can talk to somebody who's a QAnon believer for hours and show them facts and whatever, and they'll just say that you were brainwashed by the mainstream media, and they're the ones who knows what really is happening. So in that type of atmosphere, when you can have multiple competing truths, it's very difficult to come to any kind of consensus. It's not motivated by peace, but by war. It's not chastened by difference and otherness, but angered by it. And it's a very difficult place to be in a society when you can't even believe there's truth in the middle someplace, but rather everybody has their own truth. So it's not the most cheerful picture of the world, right? But if we are going to understand where we are as a society, we have to understand how that society works. We have to understand, if you're studying horticulture societies, hunter and gatherer societies, agricultural societies, you have to understand the basic underpinnings. How do they view reality? What are the structures that they use? Same thing with now. What are the forces that are happening? What is this anti-truth? What is this total, complete intolerance for differences? What is this listening to every voice? Whether this voice is knowledgeable voice or some dude I went to high school with who's now posting on Facebook because he found somebody on YouTube who said something. What we have to understand what this is if we're going to have any hope of constructively dealing with or coming out of this stage. And now I need some really scary horror movie music. I should have found some before I did this, because let's now add a global pandemic, woohoo, to post whatever pseudo-modernism stuff that we're going on. So if you have a world who doesn't believe in absolute truth, how do you get them to do what they need to do to combat an epidemic or a pandemic? Is this going to launch us into another societal way of being? Is it just an escalation of what we already have, a continuation? Did it just expose everything that we are and that this time in history is? Huge mess. I go for huge mess, honestly, myself. But that's one of the things that we're going to discuss in the class as we go. How is the global pandemic relating to all of the different topics, and what is it doing to change? When you live in a time of incredibly rapid social change, you can't just pretend it never is happening and just go back to ancient theory and talk about the world as though it was 5 years ago. Now, the textbooks I'm using are going to be about 5 years ago, so they'll be in the before times. But we will try to do some compare contrasting of the before times to now and see how the pandemic is impacting our society now and how it may continue to impact society in the future.